Hello and welcome to this Techarati interview series ahead of DevOps Live on the 8th and 9th of March at Excel London. I'm Stuart Crowley, Closer Still Media's Global Content Manager and Editor of Techarati. Today, my guest is Jaipal Sachdev. He is the Production Planning Division Lead at 3M and part of the 2022 Outstanding LGBT Plus Future Leaders list. Jaipal will join a panel at DevOps Live to discuss the importance of intersectionality. So, hi, Jaipal, and welcome to the interview series.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
First question is based around your inclusion on the LGBT plus future leaders list, role model list. So congratulations for that first. So in the feature, it mentions your experience growing up queer and overcoming challenges. So how do you think, firstly, what are those challenges and how might these challenges have shaped your career path and advocacy for diversity in tech?
It's a great question, really. But my passion for diversity, inclusion, and equity in STEM can very much be traced back to my childhood and growing up. Despite being captivated by science and manufacturing in particular, I struggled to find role models who shared my interests and background. There was no one really who looked like me or sounded like me or who identified like me. And so, the lack of representation and the stereotypes that I encountered regarding, my ethnicity or my sexual orientation only reinforced that feeling that I didn't have that sense of belonging, in the field of STEM or, technology, engineering, and maths. So, as I navigate my career, I'm driven to be more visible. I want to be that role model that I needed when I was younger. And hopefully young people can see that and be like, great, I can be that person. I can be a leader in STEM. I can find happiness in that. I'm dedicated to promoting equality and inclusiveness in STEM so that future generations aren't limited by their backgrounds or their identities.
What do you feel perhaps is the biggest challenge or blocker for DevOps professionals or C-level executives looking to implement intersectional goals? And how do you think that these challenges can be overcome?
Yeah, so there are kind of many challenges that big companies, small companies, businesses face when it comes to trying to implement these kind of goals. There are tons, right? But I'm gonna maybe talk on what I think are probably the top three. So the first one is we have a limited scope when it comes to measuring the success of our initiatives. It can be challenging to measure this because it can involve complex long-term goals that are really difficult to quantify. In STEM, we love numbers, and sometimes when people are sharing authentic stories or opening up and being themselves, that's really hard to quantify in numbers. And that makes it difficult for executives and leaders to track progress, because all we want to do is have a fancy statistic at the end of the day, like you would with your balance sheet or your profits, right? And so that's always going to be a challenge when it comes to making a very meaningful impact. There are limited ways. I think the first way in terms of overcoming this is we just need to accept that belonging and inclusion, we're not always going to have a quantifiable way of measuring this, but there are ways we can. We can do surveys, we can look at demographics as ways of measuring success. And so I think that's probably the easiest way to kind of overcome this. I think the second is that there tends to be limited resources. We're going through kind of I wouldn't say it's a recession, but a time where a lot of companies are cost cutting. And in general, when you look at initiatives that companies run, diversity, equity, and inclusion events, initiatives, resources tend to get cut, especially because they tend to be quite resource intensive, money intensive, and human capital intensive as well. So I think it's always having them within your priorities and not kind of sacrificing it just to hit a bottom line or a number at the end of the year. And then finally, I think businesses right now are very happy with the status quo when it comes to diversity and inclusion. You celebrate Pride Month in June, and you celebrate International Women's Day in March, and we need to be pushing the boundaries more and cracking and really trying to crack that formula that just works every year. How can we truly amplify and break that mold where we're not just celebrating queer people in June? How do we celebrate them all year?
A word sprung to mind, because obviously we've got the concept of greenwashing, right? We talk about greenwashing a lot right now. Perhaps there's something that could be talked about in terms of rainbow washing, perhaps. It does happen a lot in June. You'll get the pride flags, the logo changes, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I think there's a danger of running into the idea of tokenism as well, and we have to be so careful. It's great to raise the voices of minorities, but we have to do it so it's not as we're just tokens for a corporate initiative. So that's a fine balance to tread.
What do you think are the potential benefits of, let's say, a company does really do it successfully with intersectionality? What do you think are the benefits and opportunities that it presents to perhaps professionals like yourself in your career?
It's proven through so many studies and surveys that being better at intersectionality and inclusion makes you more innovative. Studies, there's a study by Deloitte showed that, organizations that with diverse teams are 45% more likely to grow in their market, and 70% more likely to capture a new market. I've seen the benefits of being in teams where we're diverse, because we'll come from different backgrounds, and that can lead to more comprehensive and more effective problem solving. When people are able to bring new perspectives, that can be so powerful. I think, and I'll hold my hand up to say, when I look for, if I am on the market, I would make sure that the future companies that I work for need to have a solid inclusion and equity plan in place. That they genuinely are meaning change. So I think that's so important, especially because the younger generation are making more conscious choices on their future employers, and we need to bear that in mind, that they want authentic initiatives that really are leading to an improvement in intersectionality. And then finally, I think company culture improves. If people can bring their whole self to work, people are happier, and happy people means more work. I guess better higher quality work is getting done, and it's just better for the entire environment.
What would you like to read in that plan, if there were to be one? What sort of things would kind of stand out to you as a positive in that plan?
I think having a very clear strategy based on numerical differences, surveys, demographics, are really important. I think we need to make sure that companies are being really transparent on, the gender ratio between board of directors, or the number of certain job grades, levels, how that split is in all the various different ways that, the different minorities essentially. So I think transparency, and then building on that transparency, having tangible, achievable goals on equity and intersectionality, that's the way forward.
So what do you think a person, a leader in a majority group or a heteronormative group, what do you think that they could do to be a better ally or advocate for diversity and intersectionality?
There are kind of steps to follow, but the first step is education. Seek out information, take the time to learn about different experiences and perspectives of underrepresented groups, and the unique challenges that they might face in the tech industry. This includes things like understanding, intersectionality, but we need to be having that conversation, understanding the privilege that we may be born with, or that we might have, and any kind of forms of systemic bias. So the first step is always education and asking questions. The second is then taking that information and amplifying the voices of underrepresented groups, and making sure that if you are part of important decision-making processes, that you use your privilege and influence to help influence those decision-making processes. And then finally, this is something you do kind of within work and outside of work, but always challenge your own biases. And also the company's inherent policies and biases as well. Every company has a culture. And the longer you're in a company, you will understand the politics and the developing biases that might exist. So making sure that we're always challenging that.
Are there any biases in particular that have stood out to you that should be addressed?
I think the biggest bias that or stereotype I think that I face, that the stereotypes kind of lead to those biases really. I think the biggest stereotype that you face is, I think people will assume that queer people don't really belong in STEM because of stereotypes that they see on TV about them being geared towards more of a creative kind of direction, which is not true because you can be super creative in STEM as well. And I think that, so for example, I remember a few years ago, I was in a meeting and I was at a big FMCG company, and I was speaking to a senior leader, and I mentioned that I was queer, and and this was while I was working within R&D, and they were surprised. And said to me, "I'm surprised that I thought your people would be more suited to marketing," and I think it was almost tailored to be a bit of a joke, a funny joke. But if I'd heard that as maybe a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old, it would have put me off from studying STEM because I would have thought STEM isn't for me. So I think that's a story that I like to tell, because sometimes jokes. Jokes that are based on stereotypes lead to a bias that can then have a profound impact on someone's future, I think. Yeah, especially if you're in a position where you can make very discernible decisions about people.
I'm just interested, based on that sort of bias conversation that we've talked about. What are your opinions on, say, things like The Big Bang Theory? If you've seen it. Obviously, Jim Parsons being the lead character, he's not openly gay in the show, but he is in his personal life. But obviously, you do also have the other characters being stereotypically nerdy, stereotypically socially unaware of things. So, do you have any opinions on that as a bias, and just out of interest?
We are shaped tremendously by what we see in the media. Tremendously shaped. If I look at my parents, I look at my family, the only exposure that they had to queer people was on TV. And so when I didn't necessarily I'm just trying to think, appear in the same way that they would see as a stereotypical gay man, that was they couldn't put two and two together. So I think TV shows and media are great, but having showing characters who are uncharacteristically not how they should be is really, really powerful. I think a good example is Brooklyn Nine-Nine, where you have I think the head of the police staff who is super stern, super serious, who's also queer, and that's not what you would class as a typical trope for a gay man on a sitcom. When you think gay men sitcom, you think ditzy or funny or sassy or rude. Yeah. But so it's nice that you have that range, and I think that's really powerful.
Looking towards the future, what might be your hopes for diversity in your career in DevOps, in tech?
That's a good question. I think remote work, especially since pandemic, is going to have a pretty profound effect on the future of, I think, most industries. And I think that remote work has had the opportunity to create, has had the potential to create more opportunities for underrepresented groups who might not have access to a traditional office environment, or might not feel as comfortable in a traditional office environment. But it also does raise questions about, equity and access to resources, as well as the new forms of bias that might exist, in virtually. And I think my other big, goal and looking future into looking into the future, I think is making sure that we're always having a focus on equity and inclusion, and genuine, authentic inclusion. Not just tokenism, Pride Month, International Women's Day. It's making sure that there are efforts to include underrepresented groups at all levels of the organization, and requires kind of a genuine commitment to that.
With your session on intersectionality coming up at DevOps Live, and with the opportunity for viewers of this interview to get a free ticket, what would you say, or what would you say is the value of in-person events like DevOps Live, and why would you encourage people to come along to your session?
So it's going to be a great 2 days. It's an opportunity to expand your network, and in-person networking, which is it kind of novel nowadays. It's just a good opportunity to gain new insights. You get to meet, you get to be exposed to all sorts of different companies, different players within your industry, and that can kind of help you understand what's out there and what's current right now. I think don't be surprised at the ability to make a good impression on people. It's an opportunity to get your name out there, and you might be surprised what happens with what kind of connections you make. And I guess specifically around our panel, it's a great panel with some incredibly diverse voices, and it will be something slightly different from maybe the rest of the panels, as it talks more about belonging and kind of inclusion. It's funny because I wouldn't say that I am part of dev. I'm not in a DevOps role. I work with a lot of data, but it's a different perspective that I'd be able to provide being in a kind of a big material science and manufacturing company like 3M.